Chapters 40, 41, and 42 of the Book of Life by Upton Sinclair. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 40. Early Marriage discusses love marriages, how they can be made, and the duty of parents in respect to them. I have shown how economic forces in our society make for later and later marriage. And at the present time, economic forces are so overwhelming that all other forces are hardly worth mentioning in comparison. You are, let us say, the mother of a boy of 18, and you have what you call common sense, meaning thereby a grasp of the money facts of life. If your darling boy of 18 should come to you with a grave face and announce, "Mother dear, I have met a girl I love, and we have decided that we want to get married," you would consider that the most absurd thing you had ever heard in all your born days, and you would tell the lad that he was a baby and to run along and play. If he persisted in his crazy notion, you and your husband and all the brothers and sisters and relatives and friends, both of the boy and the girl, would set to work by scolding and ridiculing, to make life a misery for them, and 99 times out of 100 you would break down the young couple's marital intention. But now, let us try another supposition. Let us suppose that your darling boy of 18 should come to you again and say, "Mother dear, some of the boys are going to spend this evening in a brothel, and I have decided to go along." Would you think that was the most absurd thing you had ever heard in all your born days? Or would you answer, "Yes, of course, my boy, that is what I had in mind when I made you give up the girl you loved"? No, you would not answer that. But here is the vital fact: it does not matter what you would answer, for you would never have a chance to answer. When a mother's darling wants to get married, he comes and asks his mother's blessing, but never does a mother's darling ask the blessing before he goes with the other boys to a brothel. He just goes. And maybe he borrows the money from some other fellow, and the next day tells you he went to the theater. Or maybe he picks up some poor man's daughter on the street and takes her into the park, or up on the roof of a tenement. Some such thing he does, to find satisfaction for an instinct which you, in your worldly wisdom, or your heavenly piety, spurn and ridicule. I do not wish to exaggerate. If you are an exceptionally wise and tactful mother, you may keep the confidence of your boy, and guide him day by day through his temptations and miseries, and keep him chaste. But the more you try that, the more apt you will be to come to my conclusion that late marriage is a crime against the race. The more aware you will be of the danger, either that his boy friends may break him down, or that some lewd woman may come to his bedroom in the night time. Never will you be able to be quite sure that he is not lying to you, because of his shame, and the pain he cannot bear to inflict upon you. Never will you be quite sure that he is not hiding some cruel disease, sneaking off to some quack who takes his money and leaves him worse than before, until finally he shoots off his head, as happened to a nephew of an old and dear friend of mine. Such is the problem of the mother of a son, and now what about the mother of a daughter? This seems much simpler, because your daughter is not generally troubled with sex cravings, and if you teach her the proprieties, and see that she is carefully chaperoned, you may reasonably hope that she will be chaste. But some day you expect that she will marry, and then comes your problem. If you are the usual mother, you are looking for someone who can maintain her in the state of life to which she is accustomed. If a fairy prince would come along, or a plaster saint, you would be pleased. But failing that, you will take a successful businessman, one who has made his way in the world and secured himself a position. But turn back to the figures I gave you a while ago. If this man is 30 years of age, there is at least a 50-50 chance that he has had some venereal disease. And while the doctors claim to cure these diseases absolutely, we must bear in mind that doctors are human, and sometimes claim more than they perform. Every doctor will admit, if you pin him down, that these diseases burrow deeply into the tissues, and many times are supposed to be cured when they are only hidden. Here is, in a nutshell, the problem of the mother of a daughter. If you marry your daughter at 17 to a lad of her own age, you have a very good chance of marrying her to a person who is chaste. If you marry her to a man of 25, you have perhaps one chance in 100. If you marry her to a man of 35, you have perhaps one chance in 10,000. You may not like these facts. I do not like them myself, but I have learned that facts are nonetheless facts on that account. You know the average society bud of 18 and her attitude to a boy of the same age. She regards him as a child, and you think, perhaps, that it is natural for a girl to be interested in men of 35 or even 45. But I tell you that it is not natural. It is simply one of the perversions of pecuniary sex. The girl is interested in such men because all her young life she has been carefully coached for the marriage market, because she is dressed for it and solemnly brought out and introduced to other players of this exciting game of marriage for money, with its incredible prizes of automobiles and jewels and palaces full of servants and magic checkbooks that never grow empty. But suppose that, instead of regarding her as a prize in a lottery, you let her grow up naturally, and taught her the truth about herself, both body and mind. Suppose that, instead of dressing her in ways deliberately contrived to emphasize her sex, you put her in a simple uniform and taught her to be honest and straightforward, instead of mincing and coy. Suppose she played athletic games with boys of her own age, and invited them to her home, not for jazz dancing and stuffing cake and candy, but for the sharing of good music and literature and art. Don't you think that maybe this girl might become interested in a lad of her own age, and choose him with some understanding of his real self? You take it for granted that young people should not marry until they can afford it. But stop and consider, is not this a relic of the old days? Always it takes time and deliberate effort of the reason to adjust our conventions to new facts. So face this fact: marriage today does not necessarily mean children. It may just mean love. It involves little more expense because the young people need cost no more together than they cost in the separate homes of their parents. If they are children of the poor, they are already taking care of themselves. If they are the children of the moderately well-off, their parents expect to support them while they are getting an education. And why can they not just as well live together, and the parents of each contribute their share? Let the parents of the boy give him not merely what it costs to keep him at home, but also the sums which otherwise the boy would pay to the brothels. By this argument, I do not mean that I favor keeping young people financially dependent upon their parents. My own son is working his own way through college, and I should be glad to see every young man doing the same. All that I am saying is that if parents are going to support their children while they are getting an education, they might just as well support them married as single, instead of penalizing matrimony by making all allowances cease at that point. I know a certain ardent feminist who is all for late marriage for women and abhors my ideas on this subject. She wants women to get a chance to develop their personalities, whereas I want to sacrifice them to the frantic exigencies of the male animal. Young things of 17 and 18 have no idea what they are, or what they want from life. The mating impulse is a blind frenzy in them, and they must be taught to control it, just as they are taught not to kill when they are angry. In the first place, I point out that young ladies in colleges and in ballrooms give a lot of time and thought to sex, even though they do not call it by that inelegant term. I very much question whether, if we should apply our wisdom to the task of getting our young people happily mated before we sent them off to college, we should not get a lot more serious study out of them than we do now, with all their fussing and flirting and dancing. Second, I am willing to make heroic moral efforts where I see any chance of adequate results. But I have examined the facts and definitely made up my mind that it is not worthwhile, in our present stage of culture, to preach to the mass of men the doctrine that they should abstain from sex experience until they are 25 or 30 years of age. You may storm at them, but they only laugh at you. You may pass laws and try to put them in jail, but you only provide a harvest for blackmailers and grafters. As to sacrificing a girl, my answer is simply that I believe in love, and in this I think the girl will agree with me, if you will let her. I have never heard any qualified person maintain that it hurts a girl to respond to love at the age of 17 or 18, nor do I think that it hurts a boy, provided that he is taught the virtues of moderation and self-restraint. Without these, it will hurt him to eat, but that is no argument for starving him. As for the question of his maturity and power to judge, we are able at present to keep him from marrying anybody, so I think we might reasonably hope to keep him from marrying a wanton or a slut. Certainly we might find somebody better than the peroxide blonde he now picks up at the front of the moving picture palace. The question, at what ages we shall advise our young people to have children, is a separate one, depending upon many circumstances. First, of course, they should not have any until they are able financially to maintain them. As to the age at which it is physically advisable, that is a question to be settled by the physicians and the physiologists. I myself had the idea that the proper age would be when the woman had attained her full stature, but my friend Dr. William J. Robinson sends me some statistics from the Johns Hopkins Hospital Bulletin, which startle me. This publication for January 1922 gives the results in 500 childbirths, in which the mother's age was from 12 to 16 years inclusive. It appears that pregnancy and labor at these ages are no more dangerous than in older women, but on the other hand, the duration of the labor is actually shorter, and the size of the children is not inferior. These facts are so contrary to the general impression that I content myself with calling attention to them, and leave the commenting to be done by feminists and others who oppose themselves to the idea of early marriage. End of chapter 40. Chapter 41. The Marriage Club discusses how parents and elders may help the young to avoid unhappy marriages. I will make the assumption that you would like to have a trial of my cure for prostitution. You would like to do something right here and now, without waiting for this social revolution. Very well. I propose that you shall find a few other parents of boys and girls who are in revolt against our system of hidden vice, and that you will meet and form a modern marriage club. Only you won't call it that, of course. You will tactfully describe it as a literary society, or a social circle, or an Epworth League. The parents who run it will know what it is for, just as they do today. The only difference being that it will exist to promote love matches instead of money matches. It happens that I am myself a tactless sort of a person, not skillful at avoiding saying what I mean. So in this chapter I shall content myself with setting forth exactly what this marriage club will do, and leaving it to more clever people to supply the necessary camouflage. This club will begin by correcting the most stupid of all our educational blunders, the assumption of the necessary immaturity of the young. Our young people nowadays have 10 times as much chance to learn and 10 times as much stimulus to learn as we had, and it is a generally safe assumption that they know much more than we think they do, and are ready to learn every sensible and interesting thing. I am carrying on an epistolary acquaintance with a little miss of 12, who has read half a dozen of my books, among the worst of them, and writes me letters of grave appreciation. I have talked on socialism to 1,000 school children, and had them question me for an hour, and heard just as worthwhile questions as I have heard from an audience of bankers. Never in my life have I talked about real things with children that I did not find them proud to be treated seriously, and eager to show that they were worthy of that honor. A great part of our foolishness with children is due to the emptiness of our own heads. These parents will delegate one man and one woman to make a thorough study of the sex education of the young. Of course, there is knowledge about sex which has to be given to the very youngest child, and more must be given as they grow older and ask more questions. But what I have in mind here is that detailed and precise knowledge which must be given to the young when they approach the period of puberty. At this age of 14 or 15, the man will take each of the boys apart, and the woman will take each of the girls, and will explain to them what they need to know. This duty will not be trusted to parents, for parents have an imbecile fear of talking straight to their children, and try to get by with rubbish about bees and flowers. Let every child know that the days of the hole and corner sex business is forever past, and that here is an instructed person who talks real American and knows what he is talking about, and will deal with facts instead of with evasions. This club will help to educate the youngsters, and also to give them a good time, developing both their minds and bodies, and learning to know them thoroughly. When they are 16, each one will have another talk, this time about marriage and what it means, learning that it is not merely flirtations and delicious thrills, but a business partnership and the deepest and best of all friendships. So when John finds that he likes Mary best of all the girls he knows, this won't be a subject for kidding and sly innuendo and blushes and simpering on Mary's part, but an occasion for decent and sensible talk about what each of them really is and what each thinks the other to be. If they think they are in love, then there will be a council of the elder statesmen to consider that case, and what are the chances of happiness in that love. This may sound forbidding, but it is actually what is done at present, only it is not done honestly and frankly, and therefore does not carry proper weight with the young people. I am an opponent of long engagements, but I am also an opponent of no engagements at all. I know no truer proverb than "marry in haste and repent at leisure." It would be my idea that a very young couple should announce their engagement, and then wait 6 months, and be consulted again about the matter, and have a chance to withdraw with no hard feelings, if either party thought best. If they wished to go on, they might be asked to wait another 6 months, if their elders felt very certain there were reasons to doubt the wisdom of the match. There are, of course, people who, because of disease or physical defect, should never be allowed to marry, and others who might marry, but should not be allowed to have children. There should be laws providing for such cases, requiring physical examination before marriage, and in extreme cases providing for a simple and harmless surgical operation to prevent the hopelessly unfit from passing on their defects to the future. But dealing for the moment with normal young persons, members of our modern marriage club, I should say that if, after they have listened to the warning of their elders, and have waited for a decent interval to think things over, they still remain of the opinion that they can make a successful marriage, then it is up to the elders to wish them luck. I have known of young couples who have refused to heed warnings, and regretted it, but I have known of others who went ahead and had their own way and proved they were right. There is a form of wisdom called experience, and there is another form called love. I hear the worldly and cynical rail at the blindness of young love, and I can see the truth in what they say, but also I can see the deeper truth in the magic dreams of the young soul. Here is a youth who adores a girl, and you know the girl, and it is comical to you because you know she is not any of the things the youth imagines. But who are you that claim to know the last thing about a human soul? Look into your own and see how many different things you are. Look back, if you can, to the time when you were young, and remember the visions and hopes. They have lost all reality to you now, but who could say how many of them you might have made real if there had been one other person who believed in them, and loved them, and would not give them up. I write this, and then I think of the other side, the fools that I have known and loved, the trusting women marrying rotten men to reform them, the pitiful people who think that fine phrases and sentimentality can take place of facts. I implore my young couples to sit down and face the realities of their own natures, to decide what they are and what they want to be, and if there is going to be any change, let it be made and tried out before marriage. I implore them to begin now to control their desires by their reason and judgment, to begin, each of them, at the very outset, to carry their share of the burdens and do their share of the hard work. I implore them to value independence and self-reliance in the other, and never, above all things, to marry from pity, which is a worthy emotion in its place, but has nothing to do with sex, which should be an affair between equals, a matter of partnership and not of parasitism. I think that, on the whole, the most dreadful thing in love is the use of it for preying, for the securing of favors and advantages of any sort, whether by men or by women. End of chapter 41. Chapter 42. Education for Marriage. Maintains that the art of love can be taught, and that we have the right and duty to teach it. I assume now that our young couple have definitely made up their minds, and that the wedding day is near. They are therefore, both the man and the woman, in position to receive information as to the physical aspects of their future experience. This information is now, for the most part, possessed only by pathologists, who impart it too late, after people have blundered and wrecked their lives. The opponents of birth control ask in horror if you would teach it to the young. I am now able to answer just when I would teach it. I would teach it to these young couples about to marry. I would make it by law compulsory for every young couple to attend a school of marriage, and to learn not merely the regulation of conception, but the whole art of health and happiness in sex. Perhaps the words "a school of marriage" strike you as funny. When I was young, I remember that Pulitzer founded a school of journalism, and all newspaper editors made merry. They knew that journalism could only be learned in practice. But nowadays, every city editor gives preference to an applicant who has taken a college course in reporting. They have learned that journalism can be taught, just like engineering and accounting. In the same way, I assert that marriage can be taught, and the art of love, physical, mental, moral, and even financial. I think that the day will come when enlightened parents would no more dream of trusting their tender young daughter to a man who had not taken a course in sex, than they would go up in an aeroplane with a pilot who knew nothing about an engine. The knowledge which I possess upon the art of love I would be glad to give you in this book, but unfortunately, if I were to do so, my book would be suppressed, and I should be sent to jail. Some 10 or 12 years ago I received a pitiful letter from a man who was in state's prison in Delaware, charged with having imparted information as to birth control. Under our amiable legal system, a perfectly innocent man may be thrown into jail and kept there for a year or two before he is tried, and if he is without money or friends, he might as well be buried alive. I went to Wilmington to call on the United States attorney who had caused the indictment in this case, and had an illuminating conversation with him. The official was anxious to justify what he had done. He assured me that he was no bigot, but on the contrary, an extremely liberal man, a Unitarian, a progressive, etc. "But Mr. Sinclair," he said, "I assure you this prisoner is not a reformer or humanitarian or anything like that. He is a depraved person. Look, here is something we found in his trunk when we arrested him, a pamphlet explaining about sex relations. See this paragraph? It says that the pleasure of intercourse is increased if it is prolonged." I looked at the pamphlet, and then I looked at the attorney. "Do you think you have stated the matter quite fairly?" I asked. "Apparently, the purpose is to explain that the emotions of women are more slow to be aroused than those of men, and that husbands, failing to realize this, often do not gratify their wives." "Well," said the other, "do you consider that a subject to be discussed?" "Pardon me if I discuss it just a moment," I replied. "Do you happen to know whether this statement is a fact?" "No, I don't. It may be, I suppose." "You have never investigated the matter?" The legal representative of our government was evidently annoyed by my persistence. "I have not," he answered. "But then, suppose I were to tell you that thousands of homes have been broken up for lack of just that bit of knowledge, that tens of thousands of marriages are miserable for lack of it?" "Surely, Mr. Sinclair, you exaggerate." "Not at all. I could prove to you by one medical authority after another that if the desire of the woman in marriage is roused, and then left ungratified, the result is nervous strain, and in the long run it may be nervous breakdown." The above covers only one detail of the pamphlet in question. I read some pages of it, and argued them out with the attorney. It was a perfectly simple, straightforward exposition of facts about the physiology of sex, and one of the reasons a man was to be sent to jail for several years was, not that he had circulated such a pamphlet, not that he had showed it to young people, but merely that he had it in his trunk. There is an honest and very useful book, written by an English physician, Dr. Marie C. Stopes, entitled Married Love, published by Dr. William J. Robinson of New York, a specialist of authority and integrity. The book deals with just such vital facts in a perfectly dignified and straightforward manner. Yet Dr. Robinson has been hounded by the post office department because of it. He was convicted and forced to pay a fine of $250, and the book was barred from the mails. I have so much else of importance to say in this book of love that it would not be sensible to jeopardize it by causing a controversy with our official censors of knowledge. Therefore I will merely say in general terms that men and women differ, not merely as a sex, but as individuals, and every marriage is a separate problem. Every couple has to solve it in the intimacy of their love life. And for this there are needed, first of all, gentleness on the part of the man, especially in the first days of the honeymoon, and on the part of both at all times, consideration for each other's welfare and enjoyment, and above all, frankness and honesty in talking out the subject. Reticence and shyness may be virtues elsewhere, but they have no place in the intimacies of the sex life. If men and women will only ask and answer frankly, they can find out by experience what makes the other happy and what causes pain. We are dealing here with the most sacred intimacy of life, and one of the most vital parts of life's problems. It is here, in the marriage bed, that the divorce problem is to be settled, and likewise the problem of prostitution, for it is when men and women fail to understand each other and to gratify each other that one or the other turns cold and indifferent, perhaps angry and hateful, and then we have passions unsatisfied and ranging the world, breaking up other homes and spreading disease. So I would say to every young couple, seek knowledge on this subject. Seek it without shame from others who have had a chance to acquire it. Seek it also from nature, our wise old mother who knows so much about her children. Be natural, be simple and straightforward, and beware of fool notions about sex. If you will look in the Code of Hammurabi, which is over 4,000 years old, you will see the provision that a man who has intercourse with a menstruating woman shall be killed. In Leviticus, you will read that both the man and the woman are to be cast out from their people. You will find that most people still have some such notion, which is without any basis whatever in health. And this is only one illustration of many I might give of ignorance and superstition in the sex life. I would give this as one very good rule to bear in mind. Your love exists for the happiness and health of yourself and your partner, and not for Hammurabi, nor Moses, nor Jehovah, nor your mother-in-law, nor anybody else on the earth or above it. Great numbers of people believe that women are naturally less passionate than men, and that marital happiness depends upon men's recognizing this. Of course, there are defective individuals, both men and women, but the normal woman is every bit as passionate as a man, if once she has been taught, and if love is given its proper place in life, and monkish notions not allowed to interfere, she will remain so all through life, in spite of childbearing or anything else. I say to married couples that they should devote themselves to making and preserving passionate gratification in love, because this is the bright jewel in the crown of marriage. And if lovers solve this problem, they will find other problems comparatively simple. End of chapter 42. Chapters 43, 44, and 45 of The Book of Life by Upton Sinclair. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 43, The Money Side of Marriage, deals with the practical side of life partnership, of matrimony. So far, we have discussed marriage as if it consisted only of love. But it is manifest that this is not the case. Marriage is everyday companionship, and also it is partnership in a complicated business. In our school of marriage, therefore, we shall teach the rights and duties of both partners to the contract, and shall face frankly the money side of the enterprise. One of the first facts we must get clear is that the economics of marriage are in most parts of the world still based upon the subjection of women, and are therefore incompatible with the claims of woman as a partner and comrade. They will never be right until the social revolution has abolished privilege, and the state has granted to every woman a maternity endowment, with a mother's pension for every child during the entire period of the rearing and education of that child. Until this is done, the average woman must look to some man for the support of her child, and that, by the automatic operation of economic force, makes her subject to the whims of the man. What women have to do is to agitate for a revision of the property laws of marriage, and, meantime, to see that in every marriage there is an extra legal understanding, which grants to the woman the equality which laws and conventions deny her. When I was a boy, my mother had a woman friend who, if she wanted to go downtown, would borrow a quarter from my mother. This woman's husband was earning a generous salary, enough to enable him to buy the best cigars by the box and to keep a supply of liquors always on hand, but he gave his wife no allowance, and if she wanted pocket money, she had to ask him for it, each time a separate favor. Yet this woman was keeping a home, she was doing just as hard work and just as necessary work as the man. Manifestly, this was a preposterous arrangement. If a woman is going to be a homemaker for the husband, it is a simple, common sense proposition that the salary of the husband shall be divided into three parts. First, the part which goes to the home, the benefit of which is shared in common. Second, the part which the husband has for his own use. And third, the part which the wife has for hers. The second and third parts should be equal, and the wife should have hers, not as a favor, but as a right. If the two are making a homestead or running a farm or building up a business, then half the proceeds should be the woman's, and it should be legally in her name, and this as a matter of course as any other business contract. If the woman does not make a home, but merely displays fine clothes at tea parties, that is of course another matter. Just what she is to do is something that had better be determined before the marriage. And if a man wants a life partner, to take an interest in his work, or to have a useful work of her own, he had better choose that kind of woman, and not merely one that has a pretty face and a trim ankle. The business side of marriage is something that has to be talked out from time to time. There have to be meetings of the board of directors, and at these meetings there ought to be courtesy and kindness, but also plain facts and common sense, and no shirking of issues. Love is such a very precious thing that any man or woman ought to be willing to make money sacrifices to preserve it. But, on the other hand, it is a fact that there are some people with whom you cannot be generous. The more you give them, the more they take. And with such people, the only safe rule is exact justice. Let married couples decide exactly what contribution each makes to the family life and what share of money and authority each is entitled to. I might spend several chapters discussing the various rocks on which I have seen marriages go to wreck. For example, extravagance and worldly show, clothes for women. In Paris there is a demi-monde, a world of brutal lust combined with riotous luxury. The women of this half-world are in touch with the world of art and fashion, and when the rich costumers and women decorators want what they call ideas, it is to these lust women they go. The fashions they design are always depraved, of course, always for flaunting of sex, never for the suggestion of dignity and grave intelligence. At several seasons of the year, these lust women are decked out and paraded at the race courses and other gathering places of the rich, and their pictures are published in the papers and spread all over the world. So forthwith it becomes necessary for your wife in Oshkosh or Kalamazoo to throw away all the perfectly good clothes she owns and get a complete new outfit because they are wearing something different. Of course, the costume makers have seen that it is extremely different, so as to make it impossible for your wife and children to be happy in their last season's clothes. I have a winter overcoat which I bought 14 years ago, and as it is still as good as new, I expect to use it another 14 years, which will mean that it has cost me $1.50 per year. But think what it would have cost me if I had considered it necessary each year to have an overcoat cut as the keepers of French mistresses were cutting theirs. But then, suppose you put it up to your wife and daughters to wear sensible clothes, and they do so, and then they observe that on the street your eyes turn to follow the ladies in the latest disappearing skirt. The point is, you perceive, that you yourself are partly to blame for the fashions. They appeal to a dirty little imp you have in your own heart, and when the decent women discover that, it makes them blazing hot, and that is one of the ways you may wreck your domestic happiness if you want to. Unless I am greatly mistaken, when the class war is all over, we are going to see in our world a sex war. But it is not going to be between the men and the women, it is going to be between the mother women and the mistress women. And the mistress women are going to have their hides stripped off. Men wreck marriage because they are promiscuous, and women wreck it because they are parasites. Woman has been for long centuries an economic inferior, and she has the vices of the subject people and tribes. Now, there are some who want to keep these vices, while at the same time claiming the new privileges which go with equality. Such a woman picks out a man who is sensitive and chivalrous, who knows that women suffer handicaps, pains of childbirth, physical weakness, and who therefore feels impelled to bear more than his share of the burdens. She makes him her slave, and by she gets a child, and then she has him, because he is bowed down with awe and worship. He thinks that such a miracle has never happened in the world before, and he spends the rest of his life waiting on her whims and nursing her vanities. I note that at the recent convention of the Women's Party, they demanded their rights and agreed to surrender their privileges. There you have the final test by which you may know that women really want to be free and are prepared to take the responsibilities of freedom. End of chapter 43. Chapter 44. The Defense of Monogamy discusses the permanence of love and why we should endeavor to preserve it. So far in this discussion, we have assumed that love means monogamous love. We did so for the reason that we could not consider every question at once. But we have promised to deal with all the problems of sex in the light of reason, and so we have now to take up the question: what are the sanctions of monogamy? And why do we refuse sanction to other kinds of love? First, let us set aside several reasons with which we have nothing to do. For example, the reason of tradition. It is a fact that Anglo-Saxon civilization has always refused legal recognition to non-monogamous marriage. But then, Anglo-Saxon civilization has recognized war and slavery and speculation and private property in land and many other things which we presume to describe as crimes. If tradition cannot justify itself to our reason, we shall choose martyrdom. Second, the religious reason. This is the one that most people give. It is convenient because it saves the need of thinking. Suffice it here to say that we prefer to think. If we cannot justify monogamy by the facts of life, we shall declare ourselves for polygamy. What are the scientific and rational reasons for monogamy? First among them is venereal disease. This may seem like a vulgar reason, but no one can deny that it is real. There was a time, apparently, when mankind did not suffer from these plagues, and we hope there may be such a time again. I shall not attempt to prescribe the marital customs for the people of that happy age. I suspect that they will be able to take care of themselves. Confining myself to my lifetime and yours, I say that the aim of every sensible man and woman must be to confine sex relations to the smallest possible limits. I know, of course, that there are prophylactics, and the Army and Navy present statistics to show that they succeed in a great proportion of cases. But if you are one of the persons in whose case they don't succeed, you will find the statistics a cold source of comfort to you. John and Mary go to the altar or to the justice of the peace, and John says, "With all my worldly goods I thee endow." But the formula is incomplete. It ought to read, "And likewise with the fruits of my wild oats." Marriage is a contract wherein each of the contracting parties agrees to share whatever pathogenic bacteria the other party may have or acquire. Surely, therefore, the contract involves the right to each party to have a say as to how many chances of infection the other shall incur. John goes off on a business trip, and is lonesome, and meets an agreeable widow, and figures to himself that there is very little chance that so charming a person can be dangerous. But maybe Mary wouldn't agree with his calculations, and maybe Mary would not consider it a part of the marriage bargain that she should take the diseases of the agreeable widow. What commonly happens is that Mary is not consulted. John revises the contract in secret, making it read that Mary shall take a chance at the diseases of the widow. How can any thinking person deny that John has thus committed an act of treason to Mary? I know that there are people who don't mind running such chances. That is one reason why there are venereal diseases. All I can say is that the sex code set forth in this book is based upon the idea that to deliver mankind from the venereal plague, we wish to confine the sex relationship within the narrowest limits consistent with health, happiness, and spiritual development, and that to this end we take the young and teach them chastity, and we marry them early while they are clean, and then we call upon them to make the utmost effort to make a success of that union, and to make it a matter of honor to keep marital faith. We do this with some hope of effectiveness, because we have made our program consistent with the requirements of nature, the genuine needs of love, both physical and spiritual. The second argument for monogamy is the economic one. We have dreamed a social order where every child will be guaranteed maintenance by the state, and where women will be free from dependence on men. What will be the love arrangements of men and women under this new order is another problem which we leave for them to decide, in the certainty that they will know more about it than we do. Meantime, we are for the present under the private property regime, and have to love and marry and raise our children accordingly. The children must have homes, and if they are to be normal children, they must have both the male and female influence in their lives, which means that their parents must be friends and partners, not quarreling in secret. This argument, I know, is one of expediency. I have adopted it after watching a great number of people try other than monogamous sex arrangements, and seeing their chances of happiness and success wrecked by the pressure of economic forces. To rebel against social compulsion may be heroism, and again, it may be merely bad judgment. For my part, the world's greatest evil is poverty, the cause of crime, prostitution, and war. I concentrate my energies upon the abolishing of that evil, and I let other problems wait. The third reason is that monogamy is economical of human time and thought. The business of finding and wooing a mate takes a lot of energy, and adjustment after marriage takes more. To throw away the results of this labor and do it all over again is certainly not common sense. Of course, if you bake a cake and burn it, you have to get more material and make another try. But that is a different matter from baking a cake with the deliberate intention of throwing it away after a bite or two. The advocates of varietism in love will here declare that we are begging the question. We are assuming that love and the love chase are not worthy in themselves, but merely means to some other end? Can it be that love delights are the keenest and most intense that humans can experience, and that all other purposes of life are contributory to them? Certainly a great deal of art lends support to this idea, and many poets have backed up their words by their deeds. As Coleridge phrased it, "All thoughts, all passions, all delights, whatever stirs this mortal frame, all are but ministers of love, and feed his sacred flame." This is a question not to be played with. Experimenting in love is costly, and millions have wrecked their lives by it. The sex urge in us is imperious and cruel. It wants nothing less than the whole of us, body, mind, and spirit, and oftentimes it behaves like the genie in the bottle. It gets out, and not all the powers in the universe can get it back. I have talked with many men about sex, and have heard them say that it presents itself to them as an unmitigated torment, something they would give everything they own to be free of. And these, mind you, not men living in monasteries trying to repress their natural impulses, but men of the world who have lived freely, seeking pleasure and taking it as it came. The primrose path of dalliance did not lead them to peace, and the pursuit of variety in love brought them only monotony. I stop and think of one after another of these sex-ridden people, and I cannot think of one whom I would envy. I know one who in a frenzy of unhappiness seized a razor and castrated himself. I think of another, a certain classmate in college, whom I once stopped in a conversation, remarking, "Did you ever realize what a state you have got your mind into? Everything means sex to you. Every phrase you hear, every idea that is suggested, you try to make some sort of pun to connect it somehow or other with sex." The man thought and said, "Oh, I guess that's true." The idea had never occurred to him before. He had just gone on letting his instincts have their way with him, without ever putting his reason upon the matter. That was a crude kind of sex, but I think of another man, an idealist and champion of human liberty. One of the forms of liberty he maintained was the right to love as many women as he pleased, and although he was a married man, one hardly ever saw him that he was not courting some young girl. As a result, his mental powers declined, and he did little but talk about ideas. I do not know anyone today who respects him, except a few people who live the same sort of life. The thought of him brings to my mind a sentence of Nietzsche, a man who surely stood for freedom of personality. "I pity the lovers who have nothing higher than their love." A question like this can be decided only by the experience of the race. Some will make love the end and aim of life, and others will make it the means to other ends, and we shall see which kind of people achieve the best results. Which kind are the most useful, the most dignified, the most original and vital. I have seen a great many young people try the experiment of free love, and I have seen some get enough of it and quit. I could name among these half a dozen of our younger novelists. I know others who are still in it, and I watch their lives and find them to be restless, jealous, egotistical, and idle. My defense of monogamy is based upon the fact that I have never known any happy or successful free lovers. Of course, I know some noble and sincere people who do not believe in the marriage contract and refuse to be bound by law. But these people are as monogamous as I am, even more tightly bound by honor than if they were duly married. It seems to be in the very nature of true and sincere love to imagine permanence, to desire it, and to pledge it. If you aren't that much in love, you aren't really in love at all, and you had better content yourself with strolling together and chatting together and dining together and playing music together. So many pleasant ways there are in which men and women can enjoy each other's company without entering upon the sacred intimacy of sex. You can learn to take sex lightly, of course, but if you do so, you reduce by so much the chances that true and deep love will ever come to you, for true and deep love requires some patience, some reverence, some tending at a shrine. The animals mate quickly and get it over with. But the great discoveries about love and the possibilities of the human soul in love have come because men and women have been willing to make sacrifices for it, to take it seriously, and more especially to take seriously the beloved person, the rights and needs and virtues of that person. From the lives of such, we learn that love is nature's device for taking us out of ourselves and making us truly social creatures. Early in my life as a writer, I undertook to answer Gertrude Atherton in her glorification of the sex corruptions of capitalist society. She indicted American literature for its bourgeois qualities. Among these, the fact that American authors had a prejudice in favor of living with their own wives. Mrs. Atherton set forth the joys of sex promiscuity as they are understood by European artists, and I ventured in replying to remark that one woman can be more to a man than a dozen can possibly be. That sounds like a paradox, but it is really a profound truth, and the person who does not understand it has missed the best there is in the sex relation. There is a limit to the things of the body, but to those of the mind and spirit there is no limit, and so there is no reason why true love should ever fall prey to boredom and satiety. End of chapter 44. Chapter 45. The problem of jealousy discusses the question to what extent one person may hold another to the pledge of love. Once upon a time I knew an anarchist shoemaker, the same who had sent me to jail for playing tennis on Sunday, as I have narrated in The Brass Check. I remember arguing with him concerning his ideas of sex, which were of the freest. I can hear the very tones of his voice as he put the great unanswerable question, "What are you going to do about the problem of jealousy?" And I had no response at hand, for jealousy is truly a most cruel and devastating and unlovely emotion. And yet, how can you escape it, if you are going to preserve monogamy? The anarchist shoemaker's solution was to break down all the prejudices against sexual promiscuity. Free and unlimited license was every person's right, and for any other person to interfere was enslavement. For any other person to criticize was superstition. But the power of superstition is strong in the world, and the shoemaker found men resentful of his teachings, and disposed to confiscate the rights of their wives and daughters. Hence the shoemaker's disapproval of jealousy. Other men, less purely physiological in their attitude to sex, have wrestled with this same problem of jealousy. H.G. Wells has a novel, In the Days of the Comet, in which he portrays two men, both nobly and truly in love with the same woman. One, in a passion of jealousy, is about to murder the other, when a great social transformation is magically brought about, and the would-be murderer wakes up to universal love, and the two men nobly and lovingly share the same woman. Shelley also dreamed this dream, inviting two women to share him. I have known others who tried it, but never permanently. I do not say that it never has succeeded, or that it never can succeed. In this book, I am renouncing the future. I am trying to give practical advice to people for the conduct of their lives here and now. And my advice on this point is that polygamous and polyandrous experiments in modern capitalist society cost more than they are worth. I once knew a certain high school teacher who believed religiously in every kind of freedom. When she married, she and her husband, an artist, made a vow against jealousy. But as it worked out, this vow meant that the wife had a steady job and took care of the husband, while he loafed and loved other women. When finally she grew tired of it, he accused her of being jealous. Also, she had brought it down to the matter of money. I know another woman, an anarchist, widely known as a lecturer on sex freedom. She laid down the general principle of unlimited personal freedom for all, and she tried to live up to her faith. She entered into a free union with a certain man, and when she discovered that he was making love to another woman in the presence of a friend of mine, she threw a vase of flowers at his head. You see, her general principles had clashed with another general principle, to the effect that a person who feels deep and strong love inevitably desires that love to endure, and cannot but suffer to see it preyed upon and destroyed. Let us first consider the question, just what are the true and proper implications of monogamous love? The Roman Catholic Church advocates monogamy and understands thereby that a man and woman pledge themselves till death do us part, and if either of them cancels this arrangement, it is adultery and mortal sin. I hope that none of my readers understands by monogamy any such system of spiritual strangulation. My own idea is rather what some churchman has sarcastically described by the term progressive polygamy. I believe that a man and woman should pledge their faith in love, and should keep that faith and endeavor with all their best energies to make a success of it. They should strive each to understand the other's needs and unselfishly to fulfill them within the limits of fair play. But if, after such an effort has been truly made, it becomes clear that the union does not mean health and happiness for one of the parties, that party has a right to withdraw from it, and for any government or church or other power to deny that right is both folly and cruelty. Now, on the basis of this definition of monogamy, or if you prefer, of progressive polygamy, we are in a position to say what we think about jealousy. If two people pledge their faith and one breaks it and the other complains, we do not call that jealousy, but just common decency. Neither do we call it jealousy if one expects the other to avoid the appearance of guilt. For love is a serious thing, not to be played with, and I think that a person who truly loves will do everything possible to make clear to the beloved that he is keeping and means to keep the plighted faith. You may say that I am using words arbitrarily, in endeavoring thus to distinguish between justifiable and unjustifiable jealousy, and calling the former by some other name. It does not make much difference about words, provided I make clear my meaning. I could point out a whole string of words which have good meanings and bad meanings, and cannot be discussed without preliminary explanations and distinctions. Religion, for example, and morality, and aristocracy, and justice, to name only a few. Most people's thinking about marriage and love has been made like a soup in a cheap restaurant, by dumping in all kinds of scraps and notions from such opposite poles of human thought as Christian monkery and Renaissance license, absurdly called romance. So before you can do any thinking about a problem like jealousy, you have to agree to use the word to mean something definite, whether good or bad. We shall take jealousy as a bad word, and use it to mean the setting up, by a man or woman, of some claim to the love of another person, which claim cannot be justified in the court of reason and fair play. This includes, in the first place, all claims based upon a courtship, not ratified by marriage. It is to the interest of society and the race that men and women should be free to investigate persons of the other sex and to experiment with the affections before pledges of marriage are made. If sensible customs of love and just laws of marriage were made, there would be no excuse for a woman's giving herself to a man before marriage. She should be taught not to do it. And then, if she does it, the risk is her own, and the disgusting perversion of venality and greed, known as the breach of promise suit, should be unknown in our law. The young should be taught that it is the other person's right to change his mind and withdraw at any time before marriage. Whatever pains and pangs this may cause must be borne in silence. The second kind of jealousy is that which seeks to keep in the marriage bond a person who is not happy in it and has asked to be released. The law sanctions this kind of cowardly selfishness, which manifests itself every day on the front pages of our newspapers, a spectacle of monstrous and loathsome passions unleashed and even glorified. Husbands set the bloodhounds of the law after wives who have fled with some other man, and send the man to a cell, and drag the woman back to a loveless home. Wives engage private detectives and trail their husbands to some love nest, and then ensue long public wrangles with a washing of filthy linen, and the matter is settled by a separation. The virtuous wife, who may have driven the man away by neglect or vanity or stupidity, is granted a share of his earnings for the balance of her life, and 2 more people are added to the millions who are denied sexual happiness under the law, and are thereby impelled to live as law violators. For this there is only one remedy conceivable. We have banned cannibalism and slavery and piracy and dueling, and we must ban one more ancient and cruel form of human oppression: the effort to hold people in the bonds of sex by any other power save that of love. I am aware that the reactionaries who read this book will take this sentence out of context and quote it to prove that I am a free lover. I shall be sorry to have that done, but even so, I was not willing to live in slavery myself, and I am not willing to advocate it for others. I am aware that there are degenerate and defective individuals, and that we have to make special provision for them, as I shall presently set forth. But the average normal human being must be free to decide what is love for him, and what is happiness for him. Every person in the world will have to deny himself the right to demand love where love is not freely given, and all lovers in the world will have to hold themselves ready to let the loved one go if and when the loved one demands it. I am aware that this is a hard saying and a hard duty, but it is one that life lays upon us, and one that there is no escaping. End of chapter 45. Chapters 46 and 47 of the Book of Life by Upton Sinclair. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 46. The Problem of Divorce. Defends divorce as a protection to monogamous love, and one of the means of preventing infidelity and prostitution. You will hear sermons and read newspaper editorials about the divorce evil, and you will find that to the preacher or editor, this evil consists of the fact that more and more people are refusing to stay unhappily married. It does not interest these moralizers if the statistics show that it is women who are getting most of the divorces, and that the meaning of the phenomenon is that women are refusing to continue living with drunken and dissolute men. To the clergy, the breaking of a marriage is an evil per se, and regardless of circumstances. They know this because God has told them so, and in the name of God, they seek to keep people tied in sex unions which have come to mean loathing instead of love. Now, I will assert it as a mathematical certainty that a considerable percentage of marriages must fail. It is essential to progress that human beings should grow, both mentally and spiritually, and manifestly they cannot all grow in the same way. If they grow differently, must they not sometimes lose the power to make each other happy in the marital bonds? Who does not know the man who masters life and becomes a vital force, while his wife remains dull and empty? If such a man changes wives, the world in general denounces him as a selfish beast. But the world does not know, nor does it care about, those thousands of men who, not caring to be branded as selfish beasts, fulfill the needs of their lives by keeping mistresses in secret. I knew a certain country school teacher, one of the most narrowly conventional young women imaginable, who was engaged to a middle-aged businessman. He went to New York on a business trip and stayed a couple of months, and wrote her that he had met some anarchists, and had discovered that all he had read about them in the newspapers was false, and that they were the true and pure idealists to whom the rest of his life must be devoted. The young lady was horrified, nor was she any happier when she came to New York and met her fiancé's new friends. She ought, in common sense, to have broken the engagement, but she was in love, and she married, as many another fool woman does, with the idea of reforming the man. She failed, and was utterly and unspeakably wretched. I know another man, a conservative capitalist of narrow and aggressive temper, whose wife turned into an ardent Bolshevik. The man thinks that all Bolsheviks should be shut up in jail for life, while the wife is equally certain that all jails should be razed to the ground and all Bolsheviks placed in control of the government. These two people have got to a point where they cannot sit down to the breakfast table without flying into a quarrel. I know another case of a modern scientist, an agnostic, whose wife, a half-educated, sentimental woman, took to dabbling in mysticism, and drove him wild by setting up an image of Buddha in their bedroom, and consorting with swamis in long yellow robes. I know another whose wife turned into an ultra-pious Catholic, and turned over the care of his domestic life to a priest. Is it not obvious that the only possible solution of such problems lies in divorce? Unless, indeed, we are all of us going to turn over the care of our domestic lives to the priests. Our grandfathers and grandmothers believed one thing, and believed the same thing when they were 70 as when they were 20. So it was possible for them to dwell in domestic security and permanence till death did them part. But we are learning to change our minds, and whether what we believe is better or worse than what our ancestors believed, at least it is different. Also, we are coming to take what we believe with more seriousness. The intellectual life means more and more to us, and it becomes harder and harder for us to find sexual and domestic happiness with a partner who does not share our convictions, but, on the contrary, may be contributing to the campaign funds of the opposition party. I do not mean by this that people should get a divorce as soon as they find they differ about some intellectual idea. On the contrary, I have advocated that they should do everything possible to understand and to tolerate each other. But it is a fact that intellectual convictions are the raw materials out of which characters and lives are made, and it is inevitable that some characters and lives that fit quite well at 20 should fit very badly at 30 or 40. When we refuse divorce under such circumstances, we are not fostering marriage, as we fondly imagine. We are really fostering adultery. It is a fact that not one person in 10 who is held by legal or social force in an unhappy sex union will refrain from seeking satisfaction outside. And because these outside satisfactions are disgraceful, and in some cases criminal, they seldom have any permanence. Therefore, it follows that strict divorce laws, such as the clerical propaganda urges upon us, are in reality laws for the promotion of fornication and prostitution. There's a short story by Edith Wharton, in which the divorce evil is exhibited to us in its naked horror. The story, called The Other Two, in the volume The Descent of Man. A society woman has been divorced twice and married 3 times, and by an ingenious set of circumstances, the woman and all 3 of the men are brought into the same drawing room at the same time. Just imagine, if you can, such an excruciating situation. A woman, her husband, and 2 men who used to be her husbands, all compelled to meet together and think of something to say. I cite this story because it is a perfect illustration of the extent to which the divorce problem is a problem of our lack of sense. Mrs. Wharton will, I fear, consider me a very vulgar person if I assert that there is absolutely no reason whatever why any of those 4 people in her story should have had a moment's discomfort of mind, except that they thought there was. There's absolutely nothing to prevent a man and woman who used to be married from meeting socially and being decent to each other, or to prevent 2 men from being decent to each other under such circumstances. I would not say that they should choose to be intimate friends, though even that may be possible occasionally. I know, because I have seen it happen. In Holland, I met a certain eminent novelist and poet, a great and lovable man. I visited his home, and met his wife and 2 little children, and saw a man and woman living in domestic happiness. The man had also 2 grown sons, and after a few days he remarked that he would like me to meet the mother of these young men. We went for a walk of a mile or so, and met a lady who lived in a small house by herself, and who received us with a friendly welcome, and talked with us for a couple of hours about music and books and art. This lady had been the writer's wife for 10 years or so, and there had been a terrible uproar when they voluntarily parted. But they had refused to pay attention to this uproar. They understood why they did not wish to remain husband and wife any longer, but they did not consider it necessary to quarrel about it, nor even to break off the friendship which their common interests made possible. The 2 women in the case were not intimate, I gathered, but they frequently met at the homes of others, and found no difficulty in being friendly. I suggest to Mrs. Wharton that this story is at least as interesting as the one she has told, but I fear she will not care to write it, because apparently she considers it necessary that people who are well-bred and refined should be the helpless victims of destructive manias. End of chapter 46. Chapter 47. The restriction of divorce discusses the circumstances under which society has the right to forbid divorce or to impose limitations upon it. We have quoted the old maxim, "Marry in haste and repent at leisure," and we suggested that parents and guardians should have the right to ask the young to wait before marriage, and make certain of the state of their hearts. We have now the same advice to give concerning divorce, the same claim to enter on behalf of society, that it has and should assert the right to ask people to delay and think carefully before breaking up a marriage. What interest has society in the restriction of divorce? What affair is it of any other person if I choose to get a divorce and marry a new wife once a month? There are many reasons, not in any way based upon religious superstition or conventional prejudice. In the first place, there are or may be children, and society should try to preserve for every child a home with a father and a mother in it. Second, there are property rights, of which every marriage is a tangle, and the settlement of which the law should always oversee. Third, there is the question of venereal disease, which society has an unquestionable right to keep down by every reasonable restriction upon sexual promiscuity. And finally, there is the respect which all men and women owe to love. It seems to me that society has the same right to protect love against extreme outrage as it has to forbid indecent exposure of the person on the street. There is in successful operation in Switzerland a wise and sane divorce law based upon common sense and not upon superstition. A couple wish to break their marriage, and they go before a judge, and in private session, as to a friendly advisor, they tell their troubles. He gives them advice about their disagreement and sends them away for 3 months to think it over. At the end of 3 months, if they still desire a divorce, they meet with him again. If he still thinks there is a chance of reconciliation, he has the right to require them to wait another 3 months. But if at the end of this second period they are still convinced that the case is hopeless and that they should part, the judge is required to grant the divorce. You may note that this is exactly what I have suggested concerning young couples who become engaged. In both cases, the parties directly interested have the right to decide their own fate, but the rest of the world requires them to think carefully about it and to listen to counsel. Except for grave offenses such as adultery, insanity, crime, or venereal disease, I do not think that anyone should receive a divorce in less than 6 months. Nor do I think that any personal right is contravened by the imposing of such a delay. Next, what are we going to say to the right, or the claim to the right, on the part of a man or woman to be married once a year throughout a lifetime? In order to illustrate this problem, I will tell you about a certain man known to me. In his early life, he spent a couple of years in a lunatic asylum. He lays claim to extraordinary spiritual gifts and uses the language of the highest idealism known. He is a man of culture and good family, and thus exerts a peculiar charm upon young women of refinement and sensitiveness. To my knowledge, he was 3 times married in 6 years, and each time he deserted the woman and forced her to divorce him and to take care of herself, and in one case of a child. In addition, he had begotten 1 child out of marriage and left the mother and child to starve. For 10 years or so I used to see him about once in 6 months, and invariably he had a new woman, a young girl of fine character, who had been ensnared by him and was in the agonizing process of discovering his moral and mental derangement. Yet there was absolutely nothing in the law to place restraint upon this man. He could wander from state to state, or to the other side of the world, preying upon lovely young girls wherever he went. This particular man happens to call himself a radical, but I could tell you of similar men in the highest social circles, or in the political world, the theatrical world, the sporting world. They are in every rank of life, and are just as definitely and certainly menaces to human welfare and progress as pirates on the high seas or highwaymen on the road. Nor are they confined to the males. The world is full of women who use their sex charms for predatory purposes, and some of them are far too clever for any law that you or I can contrive at present. But I think we might begin by refusing to let any man or woman have more than 2 divorces in one lifetime, in any state or part of the world. If any man or woman tries 3 times to find happiness in love and fails each time, we have a right to assume that the fault must lie with that person, and not with the 3 partners. I think we may go further yet. Having made wise laws of love and marriage, taking into consideration all human needs, we have a right to require that men and women shall obey the laws. At present, the great mass of the public has sympathy for the law breaker, just as, in old days, the peasants could not help admiring the outlaw who resisted unjust land laws and robbed the rich. Or, as today, under the capitalist regime, we cannot withhold our sympathy from political prisoners, even though they have committed acts of violence which we deplore. But when we have made sex laws that we know are just and sensible, then we shall consider that we have the right to restrain sex criminals. And in extreme cases, we shall avail ourselves of the skill of science to perform a surgical operation which will render him unable in future to prey upon the love needs of people who are placed at his mercy by their best qualities, their unselfishness and lack of suspicion. We clear out foul-smelling weeds from our garden because we wish to raise beautiful flowers and useful herbs therein. There lives in California a student of plant life who has shown us what we can do, not by magic or by superhuman efforts, but simply by loving plants, by watching them ceaselessly, understanding their ways, and guiding their sex life to our own purposes. We can perform what to our ignorant ancestors would have seemed to be miracles. We can actually make all sorts of new plants, which will continue to breed their own kind and survive forever if we give them proper care. In other words, Luther Burbank has shown us that we can change plant nature. There flash back upon my memory all those dull, weary, sick human creatures who have repeated to me that dull, weary, sick old formula, "You cannot change human nature." I do not think I am indulging either in religious superstition or in blind optimism, but am speaking precisely in saying that whenever human beings get ready to apply experimental science to themselves, they can change human nature just as they now change plant nature. By putting human bodies together in love, we make new bodies of children more beautiful than any who have yet romped on the earth. And in the same way, by putting minds and souls together, we can make new kinds of minds and souls, different from those we have previously known, and greater than either the man's soul or the woman's soul alone. Also, by the magic which is the law of mind and soul life, each new creation can be multiplied to infinity, and shared by all other minds and souls that live in the present or may live in the future. We have shown elsewhere how genius multiplies to infinity the joy and power of life by means of the arts, and one of the greatest of the arts is the art of love. Consider the great lovers, the true lovers of history, how they have enriched the lives of us all. It does not make any difference whether these men and women lived in the flesh or in the brain of a poet. We learn alike from Dante and Beatrice, from Abelard and Eloise, from Robert and Elizabeth Browning, from Tristan and Isolde, from Romeo and Juliet, what is the depth and the splendor of this passion which lies hidden within us, and how it may enrich and vivify and glorify all life. End of chapter 47. End of section 3. Part 4, The Book of Society, Chapters 48 and 49 of The Book of Life by Upton Sinclair. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 48, The Ego and the World, discusses the beginning of consciousness in the infant and in primitive man, and the problem of its adjustment to life. We have now to consider the relationship of man to his fellows, with whom he lives in social groups. Upon this problem floods of light have been thrown by the new science of psychoanalysis. I will try to give, briefly and in simple language, an idea of these discoveries. One of the laws of biology is that every individual in his development reproduces the history of the race, so that impulses and mental states of a child reveal to us what our far-off ancestors loved and feared. The same thing is discovered to be true of neurotics, people who have failed in adjusting themselves to civilized life, and have gone back, in some or all of their mental traits, to infantile states. If we analyze the unconscious minds of nervous patients, and compare them with what we find in the minds of infants and in savages, we discover the same dreams, the same longings, and the same fears. The mental life of man begins in the womb. We cannot observe that life directly, but we know that it is there, because there cannot be organic life without mind to direct it. And just as there is an unconscious mind that regulates the bodily process in adults, so in the embryo there must be an unconscious mind to direct the flow of blood, the building of bones, muscle, eyes, and brain. The mental life of that unborn creature is, of course, purely egotistical. It knows nothing outside itself, and it finds this universe an agreeable place, everything being supplied to it promptly and perfectly, without effort of its own. But suddenly it gets its first shock. Pain begins, and severe discomfort, and the creature is shoved out into a cold world, yelling in protest against the unsought change. And from that moment on, the newborn infant labors to adjust itself to an entirely new set of conditions. Discomforts trouble it, and it cries. Quickly it learns that these cries are answered, and satisfaction of its needs is furnished. Somehow, magically, things appear, warm and dry covering, a trickle of delicious hot milk into its mouth. At first, the infant mind has no idea how all this happens, but gradually it comes to realize objects outside itself, and it forms the idea that these objects exist to serve its wants. Later on, it learns that there are particular sounds which attach to particular objects and cause them to function. The sound "mama," for example, produces a goddess clothed in beauty and power, performing miracles. So the infant mind arrives at the period of magic gestures and the period of magic words, corresponding to a certain type of myth and belief which we find in every race and tribe of human being that now exists or ever has existed on earth. All these stories about magic wishes and magic rings and magic spells of 1,000 sorts, and nowhere on earth a child which does not listen greedily to such fancies. The reason is simply that the child has passed through this stage of mental life, and so recently that the feelings are close to the surface of his consciousness. But gradually the infant makes the painful discovery that not everything in existence can be got to serve him. There are forces which are proof against his magic spells. There are some which are hostile, and these the infant learns to regard with hatred and fear. Sometimes hatred and fear are strangely mixed with admiration and love. For example, there is a powerful being known as Father, who is sometimes good and useful, but at other times takes the attention of the supremely useful Mother, the source of food and warmth and life. So Father is hated, and in fancy he is wished out of the way, which to the infant is the same thing as killing. Out of this grows a whole universe of fascinating mental life, which Freud calls by the name the Oedipus complex, after the legend of the Greek hero who murdered his father and committed incest with his mother, and then, when he discovered what he had done, put out his own eyes. There's a mass of legends, old as human thought, repeating this story. We cannot be sure whether they have grown out of the greeds and jealousies of this early wish life of the infant, or whether they had their base in the fact that there was a stage in human progress in which the father really was killed off by the sons. This latter idea is discussed by Freud in his book, Totem and Taboo. It appears that primitive man lived in hordes, which were dominated by one old male, who kept all the women to himself, and either killed the young males or drove them out to shift for themselves. So the young men would combine and murder their father. The forming of human society, of marriage and family, depended upon one factor, the decision of the young victors to live and let live. The only way they could do this was to agree not to quarrel over the women of their own group, but to seek other women from other groups. This may account for what is known as exogamy, an almost universal marriage custom of primitive man, whereby a man named Jones is barred by frightful taboos from the women named Jones, but is permitted relations with all the women named Smith. To return to our infant, he is in the midst of a painful process of adjusting himself to the outside world, discovering that sometimes all his magic words and gestures fail. His wishes no longer come true. There are beings outside him with wills of their own and power to enforce them. He has to learn to get along with these beings and give up his pleasures to theirs. These processes which go on in the infant's soul, the hopes and the terrors, the griefs and the angers, are of the profoundest significance for later adult life. For nothing gets out of the mind that has once got into it. The infantile cravings, which are repressed and forgotten, stay in the unconscious, and work there, and strive still for expression. The conscious mind will not tolerate them, but they escape in the form of fairy tales and stories, of dreams and delusions, slips of the tongue, and many other mental events which it is fascinating to examine. Also, if we are weakened by ill health or nervous strain, these infantile wishes may take the form of neuroses, and fully grown people may take to stammering or become impotent or hysterical or even insane because of failures of adjustment to life that happened when they were a year or two old. These things are known, not merely as a matter of theory, but because as soon as by analysis these infant secrets are brought into consciousness and adjusted there, the trouble instantly ceases. So it appears that the whole process of human life, from the very hour of birth, consists of the correct adjustment of men and women in relation to their fellows. Not merely is man a social being, but all the pre-human ancestors of men, for ages upon geologic ages, have been social beings. They have lived in groups, and their survival has depended upon their success in fitting themselves snugly into group relationships. Failure to make correct adjustments means punishment by the group, or by enemies outside the group, if the failure is serious enough. It means death. We may assert that the task of understanding one's fellow men and making oneself understood by them is the most important task that confronts every individual. And if we look about the world at present, the most superficial of us cannot fail to realize that the task is far from being correctly performed. So many people unhappy, so many striving for what they cannot get, so many having to be locked behind bars like savage beasts because they demand something which the world is resolved not to let them have. So many having to be killed by rifles and machine guns, by high explosive shells and poison gas, because they misunderstood the social facts about them, and thought they could fulfill some wishes which the rest of mankind wanted them to repress. As I read the psychoanalyst's picture of the newly born infant with its primitive ego, its magic cries and magic gestures, I cannot be sure how much of it is sober science and how much is mordant irony, a sketch of the mental states of the men and women I see about me, whole classes of men and women, yes, even whole nations. The effort of the following chapters will be to interpret to men and women the world which they have made, and to which they are trying to adjust themselves. More especially, we shall try to show how, by better adjustments, men may change both themselves and the world, and make both into something less cruel and less painful, more serene and more certain and more free. End of chapter 48. Chapter 49. Competition and cooperation. Discusses the relation of the adult to society, and the part which selfishness and unselfishness play in the development of social life. Pondering the subject of this chapter, I went for a stroll in the country, and, seating myself in a lonely place, became lost in thought, when suddenly my eye was caught by something moving. On the bare, hot, gray sand lay a creature that I could see when it moved and could not see when it was still, for it was exactly the color of the ground, and it fitted the ground tightly, being flat, and having its edges scalloped so that they mingled with the dust. It was a lizard, covered with heavy scales and with sharp horns to make it unattractive eating. At the slightest motion from me, it vanished into a heap of stones, so quickly that my eye could scarcely follow it. This creature, you perceive, is in its actions and its very form an expression of terror, terror of devouring enemies, of jackals that pounce and hawks that swoop, and also of the hot desert air that seeks to dry out its few precious drops of moisture. Practically all the energies of this creature are concentrated upon the securing of its own individual survival. To be sure, it will mate, but the process will be quick, and the eggs will be left for the sun to hatch out, and the baby lizards will shift for themselves. That is to say, they will be incarnations of terror from the moment they open their eyes to the light. The jackal seeks to pounce upon the lizard, and so inspires terror in the lizard. But when you watch the jackal, you find that it exhibits terror toward more powerful foes. You find that the hawk, which swoops upon the lizard, is equally quick to swoop away when it comes upon a man with a gun. This preying and being preyed upon, this mixture of cruelty and terror, is a conspicuous fact of nature. If you go into any orthodox school or college in America today, you will be taught that it is nature's most fundamental law and governs all living things. If you should take a course in political economy under a respectable professor, you would find him explaining that such cruelty terror applies equally in human affairs. It is the basis of all economic science, and the effort to escape from it is like the effort to lift yourself by your bootstraps. The professor calls this cruelty terror by the name competition, and he creates for his own purposes an abstract being whom he names the economic man, a creature who acts according to this law and exists under these conditions. One of the professor's formulas is the so-called Malthusian law, that population presses always upon the limits of subsistence. Another is the law of diminishing returns of agriculture, that you can get only so much product out of a certain piece of land, no matter how much labor and capital you put into it. Another is Ricardo's iron law of wages, that wages cannot rise above the cost of living. Another is embedded in the formula of Adam Smith, that competition is the life of trade. The professor enunciates these laws, coldly and impersonally, as becomes a scientist, but if you go into the world of business, you find them set forth cynically in scores of maxims and witticisms. Dog eat dog. The devil take the hindmost. Business is business. Do others, or they will do you. Evidently, however, there is something in man which rebels against these natural laws. In our present society, man has set aside 6 days in the week in which to live under them, and 1 day in the week in which to preach an entirely different and contradictory code, that of Christian ethics, which bids you love your neighbor and do unto others as you would they should do unto you. Between these Sunday teachings and the weekday teachings, there is eternal conflict, and one who takes pleasure in ridiculing his fellow men can find endless opportunity here. The Sunday preachers are forbidden to interfere with the affairs of the other 6 days. That is called dragging politics into the pulpit. On the other hand, incredible as it may seem, there are professors of the weekday doctrine who call themselves Christians, and believe in the Sunday doctrine too. They manage this by putting the Sunday doctrine off into a future world. That is, we are to pounce upon one another and devour one another under the iron laws of economics so long as we live on earth. But in the next world we shall play on golden harps and have nothing to do but love one another. If anybody is so foolish as to apply the Sermon on the Mount to present-day affairs, we regard him as a harmless crank. If he persists and sets out to teach others, we call him a communist or a pacifist, and put him in jail for 10 or 20 years. In the Book of the Mind, I have referred to Kropotkin's Mutual Aid as a Factor in Evolution, which I regard as one of the epoch-making books of our time. Kropotkin clearly proves that competition is not the only law of nature. It is everywhere modified by cooperation, and in the great majority of cases, cooperation plays a larger part in the relations of living creatures than competition. There is no creature in existence which is entirely selfish. In the nature of the case, such a creature could not exist, save in the imaginations of teachers of special privilege. If a species is to survive, some portion of the energies of the individual must go into reproduction. And steadily, as life advances, we find the amount of this sacrifice increasing. The higher the type of the creature, the longer is the period of infancy, and the greater the sacrifice of the parent for the young. Likewise, most creatures make the discovery that by staying together in herds or groups and learning to cooperate instead of competing among themselves, they increase their chances of survival. You find birds that live in flocks, and other birds like hawks and owls and eagles that are solitary. And you find the cooperating birds 1,000 times as numerous, that is to say, 1,000 times as successful in the struggle for survival. You find that all man's brain power has been a social product. The supremacy he has won over nature has depended upon one thing and one alone: the fact that he has managed to become different from the economic man, that product of the imagination of the defenders of privilege. It is evident that both competition and cooperation are necessary to every individual, and the health of the individual and of the race lies in the proper combination of the two. If a creature were wholly unselfish, if it made no effort to look after its own individual welfare, it would be exterminated before it had a chance to reproduce. If, on the other hand, it cannot learn to cooperate, its progeny stand less chance of survival against creatures which have learned this important lesson. We have a nation of 110 million people who have learned to cooperate to a certain limited extent. Some of us realize how vastly the happiness of these millions might be increased by a further extension of cooperation. But we find ourselves opposed by the professors of privilege, and we wish that these gentlemen would go out and join the lizards of the desert sands or the sharks of the sea, creatures which really practice the system of laissez-faire which the professors teach. The plain truth is that we cannot make a formula out of either competition or cooperation. We cannot settle any problem of economics, of business or legislation by proclaiming, for example, that competition is the life of trade. Competition may just as well turn out to be the death of trade. It depends entirely upon the kind of competition and the stage of trade development to which it is applied. In the early 18th century, when that formula of Adam Smith was written, competition was observed to keep down prices and provide stimulus to enterprise, and so to further abundant production. But the time came when the machinery for producing goods was in excess, not merely of the needs of the country, but of the available foreign markets, and then suddenly the large-scale manufacturers made the discovery that competition was the death of trade to them. They proceeded, as a matter of practical common sense, and without consulting their college professors, to abolish competition by forming trusts. We passed laws forbidding them to do this, but they simply refused to obey the laws. In the United States, they have made good their refusal for 35 years, and in the end have secured the blessing of the Supreme Court upon their course. So now we have cooperation in large-scale production and marketing. It is known by various names: pools, syndicates, price fixing, gentlemen's agreements. It is a blessing for those who cooperate, but it proves to be the death of those who labor, and also of those who consume. And we see these also compelled to combine, forming labor unions and consumer societies. Each side to the quarrel insists that the other side is committing a crime in refusing to compete, and our whole social life is rent with dissensions over this issue. Manifestly, we need to clear our minds of dead doctrines, to think out clearly just what we mean by competition, and what by cooperation, and what is the proper balance between the two. I have been at pains in this book to provide a basis for the deciding of such questions. It is a practical problem, the fostering of human life and the furthering of its development. We cannot lay down any fixed rule. We have to study the facts of each case separately. We shall say, this kind of competition is right because it helps to protect human life and develop its powers. We shall say, this other kind of competition is wrong because it has the opposite effect. We shall say, perhaps, that some kind was right 50 years ago or even 10 years ago because it then had certain effects, but meantime some factor has changed, and it is now having a different effect, and therefore ought to be abolished. There has never been any kind of human competition which men did not judge and modify in that way. There is no field of human activity in which ethical codes do not condemn certain practices as unfair. The average Englishman considers it proper that two men who get into a dispute shall pull off their coats and settle the question at issue by pummeling each other's noses. But Let one of these men strike his opponent in the groin, or let him kick his shins, and instantly there will be a howl of execration. Likewise, an Anglo-Saxon man who fights with his fists has a loathing for Sicilian or Greek or other Mediterranean man who will pull a knife. That kind of competition is barred among our breeds, and also the kind which consists of using poisons or of starting slanders against your opponent. If you look back through history, you find many forms of competition which were once eminently respectable, but now have been outlawed. There was a time, for example, when the distinction we draw between piracy and sea war was wholly unknown. The ships of the Vikings would go out and raid the ships and seaports of other peoples, and carry off booty and captives, and the men who did that were sung as heroes of the nation. The British sea captains of the time of Queen Elizabeth, Drake, Frobisher, and the rest of them, are portrayed in our school books as valiant and hardy men, and the British colonies were built on the basis of their activities. Yet, according to the sea laws in force today, they were pirates. We regard a cannibal race with abhorrence, yet there was a time when all vigorous races of men were cannibals, and the habit of eating your enemies in battle may well have given an advantage to the races which practiced it. On the other hand, you find sentimental people who reject all competition on principle, and would like to abolish every trace of it from society, and especially from education. But stop and consider for a moment what that would mean. Would you abolish, for example, the competition of love, the right of a man to win the girl he wants? You could not do it, of course, but if you could, you would abolish one of the principal methods by which our race has been improved. Of course, what you really want is not to abolish competition in love, but to raise it to a higher form. There is an old saying, "All's fair in love and war," but no one ever meant that. You would not admit that a man might compete in love by threatening to kill the girl if she preferred a rival. You would not admit that he might compete by poisoning the other man. You would not admit that he might compete by telling falsehoods about the other man. On the other hand, if you are sensible, you admit that he has a right to compete by making his character known to the girl, and if the other man is a rascal, by telling the girl that. Would you abolish the competition of art, the effort of men to produce work more beautiful and inspiring than has ever been known before? Would you abolish the effort of scientists to overthrow theories which have hitherto been accepted? Obviously not. You make these forms of competition seem better by calling them emulation, but you do not in the least modify the fact that they involve the right of one person to outdo other persons, to supplant them and take away something from them, whether it be property, or position, or love, or fame, or power. In that sense, competition is indeed the law of life, and you might as well reconcile yourself to it and learn to play your part with spirit and good humor. Also, you might as well train your children to it. You will find you cannot develop their powers to the fullest without competition. In fact, you will be forced to go back and utilize forms of competition which are now out of date among adults. I have told in the Book of the Body how I myself tried for 10 years or more to live without physical competition, and discovered that I could not. I have had to take up some form of sport, and hundreds of thousands of other men have had the same experience. What is sport? It is a deliberate going back, under carefully devised rules, to the savage struggles of our ancestors. The very essence of real sport is that the contestants shall, within the rules laid down, compete with each other to the limit of their powers. With what contempt would a player of tennis or baseball or whist regard the proposition that his opponent should be merciful to him and let him win now and then? Obviously, these things have no place in the game, and to be a good sport is to conform to the rules, and take with enjoyment whatever issue of the struggle may come. But then again, suppose you are competing with a child. Obviously, the conditions are different. You no longer play the best you can. You let the child win a part of the time, but you do not let the child know this, or it would spoil the fun for the child. You pretend to try as hard as you know how, and you cry out in grief when you are beaten, and the child crows with delight. And yet, that does not keep you from loving the child, or the child from loving you. The purpose of this elaborate exposition is to make clear the very vital point that a certain set of social acts may be right under some conditions, and desperately wrong under other conditions. They may be right in play, and not in serious things. They may be right in youth, and not in maturity. They may be right at one period of the world's development, while at another period they are destructive of social existence. If, therefore, we wish to know what are right and wrong actions in the affairs of men, if we wish to judge any particular law or political platform or program of business readjustment, the first thing we have to do is to acquire a mass of facts concerning the society to which the law or platform or program is to be applied. We need to ask ourselves exactly what will be the effect of that change, applied in that particular way at that particular time. In order to decide accurately, we need to know the previous stages through which that society has passed, the forces which have been operating in it, and the ways in which they have worked. But also, we must realize that the lessons of history cannot ever be accepted blindly. The principles of the founders apply to us only in modified form. For the world in which we live today is different from any world which has ever been before, and the world tomorrow will be different yet. We are the makers of it, and the masters of it, and what it will be depends to some extent upon our choice. In fact, that is the most important lesson for all of us to learn. The final purpose of all our thought about the world is to enable us to make it a happier and a better world for ourselves and for our posterity to live in. End of chapter 49. Chapters 50, 51, and 52 of the Book of Life by Upton Sinclair. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 50, Aristocracy and Democracy, discusses the idea of superior classes and races, and whether there is a natural basis for such a doctrine. In the letters of Thomas Jefferson is found the following passage: "All eyes are open or opening to the rights of man. The general spread of the light of science has already laid open to every view the palpable truth that the mass of mankind has not been born with saddles on their backs, nor a favored few, booted and spurred, ready to ride them legitimately by the grace of God." This, which Jefferson, over 100 years ago, described as a palpable truth, is still a long way from prevailing in the world. We are trying in this book not to take anything for granted, so we do not assume this truth, but investigate it, And we begin by admitting that there are many facts which seem to contradict it, and which make it more difficult of proof than Jefferson realized. It is not enough to point out the lack of saddles on the backs and of boots and spurs on the feet of newly born infants, for the fact is that men are not exploited because of saddles, nor is the exploiting accomplished by means of boots and spurs. It is done by means of gold and steel, banks and credit system, railroads, machine guns and battleships. And while it is not true that certain races and classes are born with these things on them, they are born to the possession of them, and the vast majority of mankind are without them all their lives, and without the ability to use them, even if they had them. The doctrine that all men are created equal, or that they ought to be equal, we shall describe for convenience as the democratic doctrine. It first came to general attention through Christianity, which proclaimed the brotherhood of all mankind in a common fatherhood of God. But even as taught by the Christians, the doctrine had startling limitations. It was several centuries before church councils summoned the courage to decide that women were human beings and had souls. And today many devout Christians are still uncertain whether Japanese and Chinese and Filipinos and Negroes are human beings and have souls. I have heard old gentlemen in the South gravely maintain that the Negro is not a human being at all, but a different species of animal. I have heard learned men in the South set forth that the sutures in the Negro skull close at some very early age, and thus make moral responsibility impossible for the black race. And you will find the same ideas maintained not merely as to differences of race and color, but as to differences of economic condition. You will find the average aristocratic Englishman quite convinced that the lower orders are permanently inferior to himself, and this though they are of the same Anglo-Saxon stock. For convenience, I will refer to the doctrine that there is some natural and irremovable inferiority of certain races or classes as the aristocratic doctrine. I will probably startle some of my readers by making the admission that if there is any such natural or irremovable inferiority, then a belief in political or economic equality is a blunder. If there are certain classes or races which cannot think or cannot learn to think as well as other classes and races, those mentally inferior classes and races will obey, and they will be made to obey. And neither you nor I, nor all the preachers and agitators in the world will ever be able to arrange it otherwise. Suppose we could do it. We should be committing a crime against life. We should be holding down the race and aborting its best development. Is there any such natural and irremovable inferiority in human beings? When we come to study the question, we find it complicated by a different phenomenon, that of racial immaturity, which we have to face frankly and get clear in our minds. One of the most obvious facts of nature is that of infancy and childhood. We have just pointed out that if you are competing with a child, you do it in an entirely different way and under an entirely different set of rules, and if you fail to do this, you are unfair and even cruel to the child. And it is a fact of our world that there are some races more backward in the scale of development than other races. You may not like this fact, but it is silly to try to evade it. People who live in savage huts and beat on tom-toms and fight with bows and arrows and cannot count beyond a dozen, such people are not the mental or moral equals of our highly civilized races, and to treat them as equals and compete with them on that basis means simply to exterminate them. And we should either exterminate them at once and be done with it, or else make up our minds that they are in a childhood stage of our race, and that we have to guide them and teach them as we do our children. There is no more useful person than the wise and kind teacher. But suppose we saw some one pretending to be a teacher to our children, while in reality enslaving and exploiting them, or secretly robbing and corrupting them. What would we say about that kind of teacher? The name of that teacher is capitalist commercialism, and his profession is known as the white man's burden. His abuse of power is the cause of our present racial wars and revolts of subject peoples. A fair-minded man, desirous of facing all the facts of life, hardly knows what stand to take in such a controversy. That is, hardly knows from which cause the colored races suffer more, the white man's exploitation or their own native immaturity. To say that certain races are in a childhood stage and need instruction and discipline is an entirely different thing from saying that they are permanently inferior and incapable of self-government. Whether they are permanently inferior is a problem for the man of science, to be determined by psychological tests, continued possibly over more than one generation. We have not as yet made a beginning. In fact, we have not even acquired the scientific impartiality necessary to such an inquiry. In the meantime, all that we can do is to look about us and pick up hints where we can. In places like Massachusetts, where Negroes are allowed to go to college and are given a chance to show what they can do, they have not ousted the white man, but many of them have certainly won his respect, and one finds charming and cultured men among them who show no signs of prematurely closed-up skulls. And one after another we see the races which have been held down as being inferior developing leadership and organization and power of moral resistance. The Irish are showing themselves today one of the most vigorous and high-spirited of all races. The Hindus are developing a movement which, in the long run, may prove more powerful than the white man's gold and steel. The Egyptians, the Persians, the Filipinos, the Koreans are all devising ways to break the power of capitalist newspaper censorship. How sad that the subject races of the world have to get their education through hatred of their teachers instead of through love. Of course, these rebel leaders are men who have absorbed the white man's culture, at least in part. Practically always, they are of the younger generation, which has been to the white man's schools. But this is the very answer we have been seeking, as to whether the race is permanently inferior or merely immature and in need of training. It is not only among the brown and black and yellow races that progress depends upon the young generations. That is a universal fact of life. In the course of this argument, we shall assume that the Christian or democratic theory has the weight of probability on its side, and that nature has not created any permanently and necessarily inferior race or class. We shall assume that the heritage of culture is a common heritage, open to all our species. We shall not go so far as the statement which Jefferson wrote into the Declaration of Independence, that all men are created free and equal, but we shall assert that they are created with certain inalienable rights, and that among these is the right to maintain their lives and to strive for liberty and happiness. Also, we shall say that there will never be peace or order in the world until they have found liberty and recognition of their right to happiness. End of chapter 50. Chapter 51. Ruling classes. Deals with authority in human society, how it is obtained, and what sanction it can claim. It is possible to conceive an order of nature in which all individuals were born and developed exactly alike and with exactly equal powers. Such is apparently the case with lower animals, for example the ants and bees. But among human beings there are great differences. Some are born idiots, and some are born geniuses. Even supposing that we are able to do away with blindness and idiocy, it is not likely that we can ever make a race of uniform genius. There will always be some more capable minds who will discover new powers of life, and will compel the others to learn from them. It is to the interest of the race that this learning should be done as quickly as possible. In other words, the great problem of society is how to recognize superior minds and put them in authority. We look back over history and discover a few wise men and many rulers, but very, very rarely does it happen that the ruler is a wise man, or a friend of wise men. Far more often we find the ruler occupied in suppressing the wise man and his wisdom. There was a ruler who allowed the mob to crucify Jesus, and another who ordered Socrates to drink the hemlock, and another who tortured Galileo, and another who chopped off the head of Sir Walter Raleigh, and so on through a long and tragic chronicle. And even when the accident of a wise ruler occurs, he is apt to be surrounded by a class of parasites and corrupt officials who are busy to thwart his will. The general run of history is this: some group seizes power by force and holds it by the same means, and seeks to augment and perpetuate it. Those who win the power are frequently men of energy and practical sense, and do fairly well as governors. But they are never able to hand on their virtues, and their line becomes corrupted by sensuality and self-indulgence, and the subject classes are plundered and driven to revolt. Often the revolt fails, but in the course of time it succeeds, and there is a new dynasty or a new ruling class, sometimes a little better than the old, sometimes worse. How shall one judge whether the new regime is better or worse? Obviously, this is a most important question. It has to do not merely with history, but with our daily affairs, our voting. As one who has read some tens of thousands of pages of history and has pondered its lessons with heart sickness and despair, I lay down this general law by which revolts and changes of power may be judged. If the change results in the holding of power by a smaller number of people, it is a reaction. But if the change results in distributing the power among a larger group of the community, then that community has made a step in advance. I have seen a sketch of the history of some Central American country, Guatemala, I think, which showed 130 revolutions in less than 100 years. Some rascal gets together a gang and seizes the government and plunders its revenue. When he has plundered too much, some other rascal stirs up the people and gets together another gang. Such revolutions we regard as subjects for comic opera, and for the Richard Harding Davis type of fiction, but we do not consider them as having any relationship to progress. We describe them as palace revolutions. But compare with this the various English revolutions. We write learned histories about them and describe England as the mother of parliaments. The reason for this is that when there was political discontent in England, the protesting persons proceeded to organize themselves and to understand their trouble and to remedy it. They had the brain power to do this. They maintained their right to do it, and when by violence or threats of violence they forced the ruling class to give way, they brought about a wider extension of liberty, a wider distribution of power. Tennyson has pictured England as a state where freedom slowly broadens down from precedent to precedent. We today, reading its history, are inclined to put a sarcastic emphasis on the word slowly. But Tennyson would answer that it is better for a community to move forward slowly than to move forward rapidly and then move backward nearly as far. We have pointed out several times the important fact of biology, that change does not necessarily mean progress from any rational or moral point of view. Degeneration is just as real a fact as progress, and it does not at all follow that because things change, they are changing for the better. It is worthwhile to repeat this in discussing human society, for it is just as true of governments and morals as of living species. A nation may pile up wealth and multiply 100-fold the machinery of wealth production, and only be increasing luxury and wantonness and graft. A nation may change its governmental forms, its laws and social conventions, and boast noisily of these changes in the name of progress, while, as a matter of fact, it is following swiftly the road to ruin, which all the empires of history have traced. So far as I can discover, there is one test and only one by which you can judge, and that is the test already indicated. Is the actual effective power of the state wielded by a larger or a smaller percentage of the population than before the change took place? You will note the words actual effective power. Nothing is more familiar in human life than for forms to survive after the spirit which created them is dead. And nothing is more familiar than the use of these forms as masks to deceive the populace. There have been many times in history when people have gone on voting long after their votes ceased to count for anything. There have been many times when people have gone through the motions of freedom long after they have been slaves. Mexico, under Diaz, had one of the most perfect of constitutions, and was in reality one of the most perfect of despotisms. And we Americans are sadly familiar with political democracies which do not work. Shall we, therefore, join the pessimists and say that history is a blind struggle for useless power, and that the notion of progress is a delusion? I do not think so. On the contrary, I think it is easily to be demonstrated that there has been a steady increase in the amount of knowledge possessed by the race, and in the spread of this knowledge among the whole population. I think that through most of the period of written history, we can trace a real development in human society. I think we can analyze the laws of this development and explain its methods. And I think this knowledge is precious to us because it enables us to accelerate the process and to make the end more certain. This task, the analysis of social evolution, is the task we have next to undertake. End of chapter 51. Chapter 52. The process of social evolution discusses the series of changes through which human society has passed. We have now to consider briefly the history of man as a social being, the groups he has formed, and the changes in his group systems. Everything in life grows, and human societies are no exception to the rule. They have undergone a long process of evolution, which we can trace in detail, and which we find conforms exactly to the law laid down by Herbert Spencer, a process whereby a number of single and similar things become different parts of one complex thing. In the case of human societies, the units are men and women, and social evolution is a process whereby a small and simple group, in which the individuals are practically alike, grows into a large and complex group in which the individuals are widely different, and their relations one to another are complicated and subtle. There are two powerful forces pressing upon human beings and compelling them to struggle and grow. The first of these forces is fear, the need of protection against enemies. The second is hunger, the need of food, and the means of producing and storing food. The first causes the individual to combine with his fellows and establish some form of government, and this is the origin of political evolution. The second causes him to accumulate wealth and to combine industrially, and this is the origin of economic evolution. Because the first force is a little more urgent, we observe in the history of human society that evolution in government precedes evolution in industry. I made the statement some 20 years ago in an article in Collier's Weekly. I wrote to the effect that man's first care was to secure himself against his enemies, and that when he had done this, he set out to secure his food supply. Collier's called upon the late Professor Sumner of Yale University, a prize reactionary and Tory of the old school, to answer me. And Professor Sumner made merry over my statement, declaring that man sought for food long before he was safe from his enemies. Some years later, when Sumner died, one of his admirers wrote in the New York Evening Post that he had completely overwhelmed me, and I had acknowledged my defeat by failing to reply. Something which struck me as very funny. It was, of course, possible that Sumner had overwhelmed me, but to say that I had considered myself overwhelmed was to attribute to me a degree of modesty of which I was wholly incapable. As a matter of fact, I had had my usual experience with capitalist magazines. Collier's Weekly had promised to publish my rejoinder to Sumner, but failed to keep the promise. And finally, when I worried them, they tucked the answer away in the back part of the paper, among the advertisements of cigars and toilet soaps. Professor Sumner is gone, but he has left behind him an army of pupils, and I will protect myself against them by phrasing my statement with extreme care. I do not mean to say that man first secures himself completely against his enemies, and then goes out to hunt for a meal. Of course he has to eat while he is countering the moves of his enemies. He has to eat while he is on the march to battle, or in flight from it. But ask yourself this question: which would you choose if you had to choose? To go a couple of days with nothing to eat, or to have your throat cut by bandits and your wife and children carried away into slavery? Certainly you would do your fighting first, and meantime you would scratch together any food you could. While you were devoting your energies to putting down civil war, or to making a treaty with other tribes, or to preparing for a military campaign, you would continue to get food in the way your ancestors had got it. In other words, your economic evolution would wait, while your political evolution proceeded. But when you had succeeded in putting down your enemies, and had a long period of peace before you, then you would plant some fields and domesticate some animals, or perhaps discover some new way of weaving cloth, and so your industrial life would make progress. It is easy to see why Professor Sumner wished to confuse this issue. He could not deny political evolution, because it had happened. He despised and feared political democracy, but it was here. And he had to speak politely to it as to a tiger that had got into the house. But industrial democracy was a thing that had not yet happened in the world. It was only a hope and a prophecy, and therefore a prize old Tory was free to ridicule it. I remember reading somewhere his statement: the notion that democracy had anything to do with industry, or could in any way be applied to industry, was a piece of silliness. So, of course, he sought to demolish my idea that there was a process of evolution in economic affairs, paralleling the process of political evolution which had already culminated in democracy. Let us consider the process of political evolution briefly and in its broad outlines. Take any savage tribe. You find it composed of individuals who are very much alike. Some are a little stronger than others, a little more clever, more powerful in battle, but the difference is slight. And when the tribe chooses someone to lead them, they might as well choose one man as another. They all have a say in the tribe councils, both men and women. Their rights in the tribe are the same. They are, of course, slaves to ignorance, to degrading superstition and absurd taboos. But these things apply to everyone alike. There is no privileged caste, no hereditary inequality. But little by little, as the tribe grows in numbers and in power and intelligence, as it comes to capture slaves in battle and to unite with other tribes, there comes to be an hereditary chieftain and a group of his leading supporters, his courtiers and henchmen. When the society has evolved into the stage which we call barbarism, there is a permanent superior caste. There are hereditary priests who have in their keeping the favor of the gods, and there is a subject population of slaves. The society moves on into the feudal stage, in which the various grades and classes are precisely marked off, each with its different functions, its different privileges and rights and duties. The feudal principalities and duchies war and struggle among themselves. They are united by marriage or by conquest, and presently some stronger ruler brings a great territory under his power, and we have what is called a kingdom, a society still larger, still more complex in its organization, and still more rigid in its class distinctions. Take France under the ancient regime, and compare a courtier or noble gentleman with a serf. They are not only different before the law, they are different in the language they use, in the clothes they wear, in the ideas they hold. They are different even in their bodies, so that the gentleman regards the serf as an inferior species of creature. The kings warred among themselves, and emperors arose. The ultimate ideal in Europe was a political society which should include the whole continent, and this idea was several times almost attained. But it is the rule of history that wherever a society is built upon the basis of privilege and enslavement, the ruling classes prove morally and intellectually unequal to the burden put upon them. They become corrupted, and their rule becomes intolerable. This happened in Europe, and there came political revolutions, first in England, which accomplished it by gradual stages, and then in the French monarchy, and quite recently in a dozen monarchies and empires, large and small. What precisely is this political revolution? Let us consider the case of France, where the change was sudden and the issues precisely drawn. King Louis XIV had said, "I am the state." To a person of our time, that might seem like boasting, but it was merely an assertion of the existing political fact. King Louis was the state by universal consent, and by divine authority, as all men believed. The army was his army, the navy was his navy, and wars, when he made them, were his wars. Everyone in the state was his subject, and all the property of the state was his personal private property, to dispose of as he pleased. The government officials carried out his will, and members of the nobility held the land and ruled in his name. But now suddenly the people of France overthrew the king and put him to death, and drove the nobles into exile. They seized the power of the French state and proclaimed themselves equal citizens in the state, with equal voices in its government, and equal rights before the law. So we call France a republic, and describe this form of society as political democracy. It is the completion of the process of political evolution, and you will see that it moves in a sort of spiral, having completed a circle and got back to where it was before, but upon a higher plane. The citizens of a modern republic are equal before the law, just as were the members of the savage tribe. But the political organization is vastly larger and infinitely more complicated, and every individual lives his life upon a higher level, because he shares in the benefits of this more highly organized and more powerful. Chapter 52.